Thank you very much for joining us. We start in Japan, where Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has just landed in Hiroshima. Later, he is expected to address leaders of the G7 who are meeting in the city. It's the latest stop for Zelenskyy on a global diplomatic tour. The war in Ukraine continues to dominate discussions at the G7 summit. On Friday, the U.S. agreed to support Kyiv's access to advanced fighter jets and training for its pilots. Let's go live to our diplomatic editor, James Bays, who's covering the G7 summit for us in Hiroshima. So, James, the Ukrainian president has arrived in Japan. There was some doubts yesterday as to whether he'd be there in person, but he's there in person, a highly symbolic visit which caps a busy diplomatic week for him.
Yeah, very, very important, I think, and symbolic, seeing the pictures, rather distant pictures at this stage, but of President Zelenskyy getting off the plane now in a motorcade heading into the centre of Hiroshima to join the other leaders at the Leaders Hotel. Now, there are leaders from lots of different countries here in addition to the G7, but we are going to see President Zelenskyy, I think, standing shoulder to shoulder with the 7 countries of the G7. That's symbolic in itself because, remember, this used to be until 2014, until President Putin took over control of Crimea and annexed that from Ukraine. This used to be the G8. So you can see this potentially, and we'll have to see exactly what pictures we see in the coming days, as President Zelenskyy standing in the place that used to be President Putin's. President Zelenskyy has already, as he's landed, moments after he landed, put out a tweet. He said, Japan G7, important meeting with partners and friends of Ukraine, security and enhanced cooperation for our victory. Peace will become closer today. And of course, this follows his visit, as you said, Folly, to the Arab League summit, reaching out there to some nations that are still somewhat favourable to Moscow. They haven't taken sides. They've remained neutral. And you can speak to diplomats. There are certain places, for example, in the Middle East. One I was remarked on recently by diplomats, Dubai, right, a place where many rich Russians still go. So that's why I think the focus on the Arab League and, of course, the financial might of the Arab League. Ukraine doesn't just need weapons, doesn't just need political support. It needs money too.
Yeah, and he has the support already from the G7 leaders. I mean, they fully support him. But he's going to be looking at convincing those countries that are sitting on the fence, Brazil, India, who are also at the summit in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. From the G7 leaders, you're right, he has the political support, he has all the right noises, and he's getting more and more in terms of weapons and finance. But things like the F-16s, which now the US has decided that Ukraine can have, not from the US itself, but from other partners. He's got to get the details of that and find which NATO countries will give him the F-16s. That's, I think, one of the efforts to try and actually make that actually happen, and happen very soon, that he'll be doing with G7 partners, because many of those are NATO nations, with the exception of Japan. But as you say, yes, important outreach as well to other very big countries, countries like Indonesia, like India, like Brazil, which are major powers in the world, and right now are not, like the G7, giving any weapons. They have all taken a position of condemning the invasion, but they're not giving as much in support as Zelenskyy would like.
Yeah. James, let's talk about some of the other things on the agenda of the summit, and China's growing nuclear arsenal has been discussed there. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, and China will remain the other big focus of this G7. This is a G7 meeting, only happens every few years, but it's happening in the Asian partner of the G7, happening in Asia. China always would be a big issue. Yes, you're right, there's a nuclear declaration, the first thing that they put out as a statement, because the nuclear theme is a very important one for Japan, given where this summit is taking place in the site of the first nuclear bombing back in 1945. But on other issues too, China is in the spotlight. We've seen the draft version of the communique. And again, as we've seen in recent years, the G7 is trying to be pretty careful here. It's trying to send clear warning, red lines to China on certain issues like nuclear. At the same time, it knows that each of these 7 major economic powers trades with China, the second biggest economic power in the world. So they want to keep that trade open. They say they're not trying to thwart the economic progress of China, but on certain issues they say that they need to send a message. For example, excessive dependence of certain G7 countries on China in critical areas of the supply chain. It's also worth telling you that in the draft communique, you'd expect some sort of mention of Taiwan. At the moment, the wording we've seen pretty bland, just talking about the need for continued peace in the Taiwan Straits.
James, thank you very much. James Bass is our diplomatic editor live there in Hiroshima, Japan. While the growing tension between China and Taiwan is also on the G7 agenda, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen addressed the subject on the anniversary of her 7th year in office.
The global consensus is very clear that the Taiwan Strait issue needs to be resolved peacefully. War is not an option. Neither party can unilaterally change the status quo in a non-peaceful manner.
Well, the G7 has repeatedly accused Beijing of threats and intimidation against Taiwan. China says the group is prejudiced. Jessica Washington has been speaking to people living in the coastal Chinese city of Ximen, which is close to Taiwan.
In this factory in the city of Xiamen, there are more than 1,000 workers, and most of them are from mainland China. All except their boss, Han Yinghuan, who is from Taiwan. He was one of the first Taiwanese investors to come to Xiamen more than 30 years ago.
We are all Chinese. The two sides of the strait are also a family, and we have 100% support from our compatriots here.
And he says recent tensions in the region haven't dampened his confidence in opportunities for collaboration.
We always hope that two sides can integrate and develop, and not argue over trivial matters.
Han is the type of success story Beijing wants to highlight, an example of cross-strait success. But his views don't represent the majority in Taiwan. Opinion polls have repeatedly showed only a small minority support unification in the long or short term. These tour groups waited eagerly for their first glimpse of Taiwan.
It's a short journey of just 3 kilometers from China's Xiamen to Taiwan's Kinmen Islands, and you can see them just behind me there. This is about as close as we can get traveling by boat from the mainland.
Last month, China carried out air and sea drills, its People's Liberation Army, or PLA, simulating an encirclement of Taiwan.
What I expect moving forward is not necessarily risk of conflict, but certainly the potential for miscalculation, for accidents, and for misunderstanding. The current situation is quite risky in terms of that lack of crisis communication mechanisms between the two countries and the heightened activity around Taiwan by the PLA.
For these travellers, the coast of Xiamen is more a holiday hotspot than a geopolitical flashpoint. But many people come here just to see Taiwan from a distance.
I hope our motherland will be reunified soon. All Chinese people dream about this.
China is developing very well and Taiwan is not. The Communist Party is doing a very good job.
Even the children aren't just here for fun on the beach. This group is known as the Young Pioneers of the Communist Party, led by Chinese soldiers who are teaching them about patriotism and reinforcing the message of one China. Jessica Washington, Al Jazeera, Xiamen, China.